So we need to talk about Lord of the Rings and the far right. And specifically, we have to talk about something I wish honestly didn't exist: Italian fascist Hobbit camps. And do some engagement or else nobody's gonna see, and if you really can, donate to the show. Now, I love Lord of the Rings, which is why it really pains me to see it being used and abused by the far-right fascists around the world, and in particular, Giorgia Meloni and her fascist Fratelli d'Italia party. See, unlike what Hollywood movies want you to think that fascism was wiped out in 1945, very much the opposite was true. In fact, in 1946, the Italian social movement, the first post-war fascist party, was set up, and that party would still be going around until the 90s. Their current iteration, after several splits, is literally the current governing party of Italy, led by "this Barbie is a fascist" Giorgia Meloni. Now, in the immediate post-war period, it was really hard to sell fascism in Italy because people actually remembered what it was like to be governed for 2 decades by Benito Mussolini. But by the 1970s, there were a bunch of new impressionable young people to bring into fascist social movements, and one of the things the fascists saw was going on was the intense popularity of things like Woodstock. So they thought, what if we did one of our own? And importantly for our story, you have to understand that The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit aren't translated into Italian until the 70s, meaning they get their wave of hyper popularity in the 1970s counterculture. And seeing this book becoming hyper popular amongst young people, the Italian fascist movement is like, that's the ticket, boys. And very conveniently for them, J.R.R. Tolkien ends up dying in 1973. So in 1977, the first Italian Hobbit camp is set up by the Italian fascist movement, bringing together people from around the social and civil society sphere, arts and culture and music, to present a festival of engagement, fun, and fascism. And as you can see from the photos, it does look like a fashy Woodstock, minus a few Celtic crosses that become popular post-war as a fascist symbol because of this particular event. They even had a band named Fellowship of the Ring. And you have to think, this isn't a time before forums or social media, so they've figured out that if you can infiltrate a fandom that is getting really popular and really big, you can start steering the objective politics of all of these young people, especially if you're the one printing reviews, you're running the book clubs, you're running the meetups, and you're doing all the things. You create the reading of Lord of the Rings, you create the lens through which it is seen through, and this was highly, highly profitable for the far right. They recast Tolkien instead of a man who was in love with mythology and linguistics and the wonderful world of multiculturalism and multilingualism that he'd created, into one that created him instead as the next father of far-right thought, on the same level of Mussolini and Julius Evola. Giorgia Meloni herself has described Lord of the Rings as the Bible for the far right. And just a year ago, she spent 250,000 euros on a Tolkien exhibition in Italy because she wanted to celebrate the anniversary of his death. Now, the Hobbit camps kept going on and they kept getting bigger and bigger. Eventually, there was infighting, of course, between fascists and the MSI, and they were ended. But importantly, the concept wasn't dropped forever, and it was immediately picked up, and Giorgia Meloni herself started up a new festival based around a new fantasy series, literally the never-ending story and her Atreyu festival. I think it's important to point out that Atreyu is a literal child soldier in that story. I think it's also important to point out that a bunch of ministers from non-fascist governments have been going to speak at Atreyu Festival, including from Keir Starmer's UK Labour government last year. Ironically, only a few short years earlier, the professor had become aware that he had what he described as "my deplorable cultists," his fans that completely misunderstood his work and took it away from what he intended, stating that they don't know what they've been moved by and they're quite drunk on it. Giorgia Meloni believes books like The Silmarillion, books that are about exiles and refugees and the human hubris of trying to pretend themselves as having the right to dominate others, as endorsements of those kind of politics, endorsements of mass deportations, endorsements of cultural hegemony, endorsements of believing in a moral geography. And this only shows that she has not read her Tolkien, even though she finds herself and presents herself as a super fangirl. She fundamentally doesn't understand the lessons of these books because she has grown up in an environment in the Italian far right that has spent decades weaving together tales to describe these books as the Bible for fascism. It is also very resonant that the far far-right in Italy and around the world have corrupted these works, just like Tolkien writes about Sauron and Melkor corrupting the works of Eru and the Valar, twisting their words, creating religions and false beliefs, and thus enslaving most of the populations of Middle-earth for thousands and thousands of years. For that is the reality of the world of Lord of the Rings. It is a world that is in many ways post-apocalyptic, and it is a world that faces the reality of having been conquered for the most part, for most of its existence, by quite literally dark lords of evil. But even this view simplifies his world, as Tolkien's writings explain that the people in the south and the east never gave up their fight. They kept going throughout the entirety of Middle-earth's history, never being completely controlled, always rebelling against Morgoth and Sauron. Which is why we also see, after the War of the Ring and the subsequent wars that followed, you see the kingdoms of Rohan and Gondor finding peace with the kingdoms of the East and the South. This is a new world, a fourth age. There is no return to the world of the past. There is no Numenor restored. There is only the human world moving forward. But nothing will help you understand better than the professor's response to a Nazi publisher who asked him if he was Aryan in 1938 in order to publish The Hobbit. Thank you for your letter. I regret that I am not clear as what you intend by Arish. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is, Indo-Iranian. As far as I'm aware, none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects. But if I'm to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. My great-great-grandfather came to England in the 18th century from Germany. The main part of my descent is therefore purely English, and I am an English subject, which should be sufficient. I have been accustomed nonetheless to regard my German name with pride, and continue to do so throughout the period of the late regrettable war, in which I served in the English army. I cannot, however, forbear to comment that if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule in matters of literature, the time is not far distant when a German name will no longer be a source of pride. Tolkien would top this off in a letter to his son 3 years later, stating, "I have in this war a burning private grudge against the ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler, ruining, perverting, misapplying, and making forever accursed the noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light." And that little interaction is why The Hobbit doesn't get published in Germany until 1957. Right now, the far right is seeking to control and pervert everything to their ends. They might have made Hobbit camps in far right Italy, but we can't let them control The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings.